such an important part of writing a story that sometimes is focused on from the very first line that you read. Pacing can take the form of an iconic opening line, an interesting character, or a big action scene. Traditional writers swear by the first impressions of your stories, and that's why so many traditional writers write such iconic opening lines. Lines like Fahrenheit 451's "It was a pleasure to burn," or Moby Dick's "Call me Ishmael." The first line grabs your attention. It's provocative. But it quickly disappears as the rest of your story catches up, because now it's not about that opening line, it's about your world and your characters. And it's about how you, as the writer, present all of that information. And that, how you present it, is the pacing. Let's look at some examples, starting with the slow burn books. The Dragonbone Chair by Tad Williams exists in this transitional state of fantasy. It's traditional fantasy that's constantly referenced as influential to the modern fantasy authors that we love today. Tad's fantasy series was one of the things that inspired me to write my own 7-book trilogy. I read Tad and was impressed by him, but fantasy got a bad rep for being very formulaic and ritual. When I read The Dragonbone Chair and said, my God, they can do something with this form, and it's Tad that's doing it, it's one of my favorite fantasy series. Even in the realm of fantasy, The Dragonbone Chair, and the entire series, honestly, is an extremely slow burn. And of this first book, the first 200 pages of this novel exists in a castle where not much is happening. The inciting incident of this book truly starts much later in the book. Tad Williams mentions that this is by design, but it's led to many readers putting the book down. It's certainly the thing that the largest percentage of readers have had a problem with, although some other readers love it. I intended, as I think Tolkien did, to start slowly in order to familiarize readers. Now, this isn't to say that slow pacing is a bad thing. There's a lot of readers that find that slow burn style of pacing rewarding, and those who stick out the slow burn of Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn claim it to be one of the greatest fantasy series of all time. The slow burn allows Williams to open up the world of Austin Ard like unfolding a map and slowly revealing new places and cultures and information to the reader in a way that isn't overwhelming. And this sort of world building done in a shorter page count could be just as difficult for readers to accept as slow pacing. On the other end of the spectrum are books like Skyward by Brandon Sanderson. I recently read this and was amazed at the speed to which Sanderson got to the point. There was world building, there was character development, and there was a clear presentation of stakes, all important parts of hooking the reader. But the whole reason people pick up this book is to see spaceships and dogfights and aliens. I mean, that's the whole selling point of the book. In many cases, other authors would take a route of longer world building. Maybe they think that the reader truly needs to understand where the main character is coming from. Establish the current situation before they get the main character to the flight school, much less until that character gets into a spaceship. I mean, after all, half of the hero's journey is about establishing that ordinary world. But the hero's journey isn't a framework that you have to follow religiously. And Sanderson is able to follow much of that hero's journey in this novel, but he uses a common trick in hooking the reader quickly. The action prologue is a tool that every writer should have in their writing toolbox. It allows you to craft a scene that's exciting and stakes-driven, sets expectations, but it has little effect on your establishing shot of your main character. Look, here's a well-known example, A Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin. The opening of this epic series isn't done with any of the main characters. There's no Stark or Targaryen or Lannister. Instead, Martin creates a scene that provides some world building. It shows the reader his writing style, and it leads to a conflict that results in the death of our POV characters. Immediately, the reader is aware that this series is one of high stakes, of danger, some sort of fantastical enemy, and realism. Now, this specific example is lacking one thing. The chapter that follows the prologue here is interesting and engaging in itself. One could argue that the action prologue is not really needed to grab the reader's attention, but that's more of a compliment to Martin than anything. Another example is The Eye of the World from Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time. This is the first book of a huge series, and it starts with an action prologue that, again, like Martin, displays the sheer power of magic in this world and shows how high the stakes can be. Magic in this world, when wielded by someone extremely powerful, can be world-altering. The following scene here, the first chapter of the book, is a better example of why an action prologue can be of good use. The start of The Eye of the World is much slower, and we spend time learning about a small village, the relationships between characters. It takes a number of pages before a true inciting incident happens, although an argument could be made that there's a number of different moments. But either way, the action prologue is not a throwaway scene. It should have some relevance to the main story. Don't mistake that this scene is one that's completely isolated. It still needs to serve a purpose just as any other scene in your book. Writing your novel full of scenes with character development, conflict, plot movement, world building, all intertwined is how you effectively manage pacing. And it's largely the main factor in what we call addictive writing. Why should a writer be so aware of their pacing? Well, we saw that slow pacing is a recurring reason why readers put down a book, but I don't think I've heard many readers complain about a book being too exciting. If you haven't heard of this book or this genre of book, then let me introduce you to lit RPGs, often referenced as or alongside progression fantasy. And one of the masters of this genre is Will White. His Cradle series, beginning with Unsold, is a prime example of addictive storytelling. This is a quality of fast-paced stories. With things moving so quickly, there's always a reason to turn the page. There's always a reason to get to the next chapter. Now, I first learned of this concept when going through the masterclass given by Goosebumps author R.L. Stine. Stine talks about ending each chapter on a cliffhanger, trying to convince the reader at the end of each chapter that something terrible or unexpected or dangerous has happened. And White does something similar in his books. He always raises the stakes. In one book, you meet a character that is so incredibly powerful that it seems like there's no way the main characters can win. In the next book, the stakes are raised because your new villain makes the previous book's villain look like a child. Every time that the main character gets stronger, they're once again placed in a situation where they're the underdog. Taking an element like this and incorporating it into your writing is an easy way to create the tension required for addictive storytelling. But beware the classic downfall of this sort of storytelling, power creep. For those who don't know what power creep is, it's a classic joke that a D&D campaign begins with adventurers clearing a basement of rats and then ends with that same adventurers killing God. Like anything we're bound to talk about on this channel, pacing is just a tool. How you use that tool is up to you. Delicate work may require delicate pacing. If your intention of your story is to showcase the world building, then slow pacing may be the right way to use pacing. Dune is a great example of this. If you're trying to create the next American classic like East of Eden, then you may use a slow pacing to do that. Work that's less delicate may allow you to use pacing in a more wild manner. If you're ripping through and writing a fun, exciting science fiction, young adult adventure, then roller coaster pacing makes way more sense. Pacing is most frequently a problem when the reader is expecting one style of pacing but encounters another style of pacing. That disconnect between what the author is offering and what the reader expects is a hallmark of failed writing. Our next video will talk about how to effectively communicate genres, pacing, trope expectations to the reader so that this sort of disconnect and disappointment can be avoided. So some takeaways from this video. 1. Pacing is the main reason that readers put down a book. 2. Depending on the nature and the purpose of your book, pacing can be used differently. Slow pacing is best used in a story that focuses on intention, and that can be a rewarding experience. Quick pacing, alongside creating conflict and tension, leads to an addictive reading experience. And readers will have, depending on their understanding of your book, different expectations regarding pacing. Thanks for checking out this video. Like and subscribe if you want more videos on writing theory. You can check out my website at www.writing-theory.com. It has more content like this and more in-depth articles on how to make your writing better.